we knew this was coming. We didn't know for sure exactly how it would happen, but Russell Wilson got released or has been notified. All these guys, by the way, I don't think they've all been officially released. I think they've mostly been notified that they will be released by their teams,
Sure.
which is a little bit of a semantics argument. But Russell Wilson is going to be released by the Broncos. It was pretty obvious that there was no way they were going to be able to trade him with his contract unless they took on a huge chunk of his salary. But even then, he had a no trade clause and no incentive to help the Broncos at all. This is the way the Broncos have treated Russell Wilson this offseason has made Seattle fans who have really a predisposition to not be sympathetic to Russell Wilson very unsympathetic to Russell Wilson. It's really turned. I think most fans are against the Broncos on this. And there's a part of this that you and I haven't talked about, which is so they're going to take on $85 million in cap hit. Trading for Russell Wilson is obviously has had bad results for the Broncos. It's possible that there's been no worse decision in this than Sean Payton's decision to become the coach of a team that was led by Russell Wilson and the Broncos hiring a coach who was going to conflict with Russell. And also, by the way, painting themselves into two corners with those guys because they gave up draft picks for Sean Payton. They're paying him a ton of money. Russell Wilson, they gave up draft picks for. They're paying a ton of money. And then these two guys get into this apparent power struggle. And now Sean Payton is 62 years old, coaching a team they're going to be missing 20% of their cap space for the next 2 years and have no answer at quarterback unless you think Jarrett Stidham is somehow the answer.
Yeah.
I don't know that there's been, it's to me, it's not even a question. Jamal Adams is not even a question compared to this move by the Broncos.
Yeah, I mean,
there's never been a worse trade in the history of the NFL than the Russell Wilson trade.
It's definitely one of the worst trades in
Name
NFL
one
history.
that competes.
You could say that Mike Ditka trading all his picks to draft Ricky Williams was pretty bad. There's been the Herschel Walker trade was really, really bad. But when you're talking about, those were running backs. When you're talking about a quarterback who's supposed to be the face of your franchise, this is what happens to poorly run franchises. If you can't, and this is why the draft becomes so important. If you can't find a quarterback in the draft, and the Broncos they tried very hard to find a quarterback for many years in the draft and could not do it. Well, you end up having to throw money at the problem, and that's what they did. They threw money at Russell Wilson to be their quarterback. Their mistake, that in and of itself was probably a mistake. We now know didn't work out well. But to compound that problem by throwing a ton of money at Sean Payton as your coach makes it even worse. Because now not only are you paying Russell Wilson to go away, you're paying him a lot of money to go away. You're still paying Sean Payton more than I think he's the highest paid coach in the NFL. If he's not the highest paid, he's definitely one of the highest paid coaches. So you're paying your coach a ton of money to suck as well. So This is a problem. It's so funny to me because in like the NBA, man, coaches get fired like every other day for like sneezing in the wrong player's direction. If a star player on an NBA team just has one bad day with his coach, that coach is going to be fired very shortly. In the NFL, teams choose to side with the coach over the player in many instances, and it doesn't often work out. Like, why do you keep siding with your coaches? Like, I understand if the player that you're turning your back on is not very good, that's one thing. But when it's a guy who's proven himself, and this is maybe the only time I'll ever defend Russell Wilson, so enjoy it while it lasts. But when it's a player who is proven to be a capable quarterback in the NFL, to just throw that money away seems very foolish.
Yeah.
You could say that Russell Wilson's first year on the job in Denver was bad for many reasons, but I think one of the primary ones is he had an incompetent head coach. A first-time head coach that really didn't know what he was doing, and as a result, his offense just did not work for Russell Wilson. Last year, Sean Payton comes in. Russell improves. He's much more like the Russell Wilson we're used to seeing in Seattle. And so to just notice that there was that much of an increase from one year to the next shows you that this guy can actually still play. So for Sean Payton to just say, hey, I don't really care. We're going to go in a different direction because I want to. I understand it. I understand why he would feel that way. But with the finances involved, you cannot just pay somebody that amount of money to go away and expect to rebound anytime soon. Like, I don't understand when you're paying somebody that much money to not play for your team, how are the Broncos supposed to get better anywhere in the near future? I mean, Sean Payton might get run out of town before his contract is over because it's going to be very, very hard for the Broncos, especially in that division, to perform well. There's just no easy way unless they strike gold in the draft.
It's also a guy that has shown a willingness to like leave when shit gets tough. He left New Orleans before cap hell finally hit, right? Like, and he's created this cap hell. And I want to talk about one. There's another part of this that's kind of an underappreciated fuck up by is it George Payton or Patton? I think it's
either Payton or Patton. I can't remember which one. It's Payton. Gotcha. It's like a normal sounding last name that he spells like an idiot.
He did it himself. He's from California, which makes me think that it's possible it has a Spanish pronunciation. But
no, it's definitely Payton or Patton. I've heard it a few times, but I can't remember which one off of it. Doesn't matter. George P.
Jorge Payton. Jorge Payton. The fuck up that he really made was when he hired Nathaniel Hackett to try to lure Aaron Rodgers to Denver, and then swung and missed on Aaron Rodgers, and just went like, well, they made that decision without the quarterback in place. Yeah. And then they were like, then they brought in a guy it's just like compounding fuck ups. Like any two of those three mistakes would be franchise destroying. But now you have this, it's like all the let's say they go draft JJ McCarthy, which they probably will have to, or they'll have to draft somebody because there's no other real method they have of acquiring a quarterback because they don't have a pick until the third round. They don't have any cap space. I mean, they probably have some cap space, but they don't have a ton of cap space. They got these two enormous cap hits, but you don't get any of the benefit of the cheap quarterback rookie contract because you got $45 million, on average, it's like what, 37 and 49 or something like that are. I mean, it's just an insane mistake, and I just can't imagine. Again, like you said, you get to the end of these 2 years where you're in Russell Wilson purgatory. Probably, by the way, watching him go make the playoffs with another team because they'll be able to surround him with a lot of talent with the money.
He's not going to cost another team anything at all, basically, right, financially. Yeah.
This is you made fun of me for this, but somebody's going to really benefit from Russell Wilson being essentially free. And at the end of that is, do you still want Sean Payton to be your coach? And does Sean Payton still want to be? He's going to be 64 or 65 years old when that time comes around.
I mean, this is really, for Sean Payton, it's crunch time. Like if you're truly a great coach, you're going to have to prove it now more than ever before. I mean, it's just trying to get the guys that they're going to have there to play well is going to be very difficult. And maybe they can do it. Maybe he knows something. I mean, I totally understand where Payton would come from, the standpoint that I just don't like Russell Wilson as a person, or his personality doesn't vibe with mine, because I think what we've seen the last couple of years is the cracks in Russell Wilson's armor that show he might be a very difficult person to work with. That doesn't mean he's a bad person. It just means when you're in a team environment, especially one that's in a pressure cooker like an NFL team, if you are not on the same page as, the other high profile person, in this case, coach and quarterback, then it's just never going to work out, no matter how talented that person may be. So, I can understand why Payton would look at Russell and say, this is just not going to work out personality-wise, and we need to separate. But the finances involved just make it so you think you would give it more of a shot than they did. And, I mean, you're right. Wherever Russell Wilson goes next, unless he's just like such a terrible negotiator, his agent is such a terrible negotiator that they try to strong arm their way into a contract that ultimately won't pay them more, but screw over the team that they're with. He shouldn't cost his team much, and that should give them the freedom to, surround him with parts that should help them win. Where even if he just plays like an average version of Russ, that you're going to be very competitive, and that's important.
Yeah, I think that I've been thinking a lot about what he's going to do, because if you're him, you want to probably go be a starter for those 2 years. And really the only way to guarantee that he would be a starter is to hurt the team, to make it painful for the team that he plays for to get rid of him. And to do that, you'd have to attach money to it, and then you start to become less valuable. It's like there's weird incentives. Russell Wilson's free agency is going to be one of the most fascinating things. Real quickly before we move on, I want to make this is my bold prediction where he's going to end up. the many people believe the best player in this draft is Marvin Harrison Jr. The Washington Commanders have, first off, they're in the Virginia area where Russell Wilson grew up. They're on the East Coast. They're not, they're a short flight from Atlanta, where Ciara, I believe, is from, or at least is a place where she could be, maybe live or be an entertainer. Obviously, Atlanta's also on this list, but I think the Washington Commanders are a sleeper team because, one, they could trade out of that spot for a quarterback-hungry team, probably accrue a ton of draft capital. Also, they could draft Marvin Harrison Jr. potentially and give him a weapon and just build a team around Russell Wilson and Marvin Harrison Jr. and Terry McLaurin that's like really, really like the passing game situation could take a huge shift in Washington. And Dan Quinn, familiar obviously with Russell Wilson. Cliff Kingsbury is your offensive coordinator there, which it's always hard for me to figure out the like offensive coordinator fit, but it doesn't seem to me like a horrible fit for Russell Wilson. And he could be taking the Washington Commanders to a Super Bowl. I mean, it's like they're also in the NFC, which makes it like, and probably outside of having to get through San Francisco, a somewhat easier path to a Super Bowl.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. That's definitely a possibility. I guess it just comes down to what Dan Quinn thought of Russ when they were together in Seattle. And granted, sure, Quinn had the luxury of being with early Russ, young Russ, who by all accounts was much easier to work with than later term Russ.
It's also possible that present day Russ will be easier than 2023 and 2022 Russ because he has to be.
I mean, what you're basically saying is that this process would have humbled Russell Wilson. I don't think we've ever seen anything from Russell Wilson that indicates this guy can be humbled.
But what did you see from Baker Mayfield that made you believe he'd humble himself and go be a backup somewhere and do?
I never thought he was like. I never thought he didn't have the stories that came with him that came with Russ. I mean, he seemed to be generally well liked by his teammates and his coaches. So whether you might think he's a little bit bombastic in the way that he like presents himself, but
he's Mr. Bombastic.
Mr. Boombastic. He's very boombastic. But the people that were around him seemed to like him. So, and obviously I would have to think Dan Quinn would trust Pete Carroll's opinion. If he talks to Pete and John Schneider and they're like, dude, don't do this, then obviously that would change things. So you're right. I mean, if Russell was just a model citizen, everything you want in the locker room, if he was like what Geno Smith is, then the finances would make it a no-brainer that all these teams would want him. But, I think for a lot of these teams, they're going to have to see what version of Russ they're getting in order to decide if this is the way they want to go. And I think, like you said last week, I think the most likely scenario for Russ is that he's just constantly going to be on these one-year deals for a while, just bouncing from team to team.